Greetings, everyone. Neal here from the Garrett Public Library for this week's Railroader Reading. I hope all of you have had a good week. I have a single selection from the book Walk in My Combat Boots from James Patterson and Matt Eversmann. This is one veteran's memories of his fallen brothers. Shivan Sivalingam was born in Singapore. His family immigrated to the United States in 1984, and he grew up in Austin, Texas. While attending Texas A&M University in the mid-1990s, Shivan began serving as an intern in the federal government. After graduating, he received a commission in the U.S. Navy Reserve. In 2005, Shivan left federal service to work as a defense contractor. He has been recalled to active duty on 5 occasions, most recently to serve as a liaison officer for the U.S. Navy's Fifth Fleet at Special Operations Command Central in Tampa, Florida. 10 years have passed since I shared the story of my friend Roz with some of you. Others of you may have heard bits as we've met in the years in between. Roz and Sean, two of my teammates in Afghanistan, set off on the Kabul-Bagram Road 10 years ago today. A short time after 8 that morning, both were lost. There are many storylines that I think about from that day. The tremendous leadership from an unlikely hero, the friendship and community from Roz's family, and so many others in the years since. Obviously, the guilt, but most of all, I think about the difficult fact that life will deceive us with relative predictability for long periods until, at the moments when we begin to feel the most comfortable, it unfolds, reminding us how powerless we all are. As we approach Memorial Day, of course I remember Roz. However, on this day, we must be obliged to remember as many of our fallen friends as possible. While some of us, by good fortune, may not have a loved one or even acquaintance who has perished in the conflicts, isn't that all the more reason for those of us who have lost someone to share their stories? What follows are some stories of a few friends no longer with us. Mosin. With much in common, Mosin and I became fast friends at my camp in Kabul. We were both junior officers in a headquarters camp, both of South Asian descent, and both exceptionally charming young gentlemen for the times. Charm, we should be reminded, is one of those forgotten casualties of war. Mohsen, a Pakistani, had just completed a tour in Iraq and had gone home only long enough to get married before returning to harm's way. We ate dinner together most days, recounting the events of the past few hours and our plans for the day that was to follow. Mohsen was especially excited during one of his first Fridays at the camp, as that was the day of the big bazaar. Vendors from all over the area would set up an open-air market just outside the camp, peddling everything from furniture and antique rifles to pirated DVDs and all manner of trinkets in between. After lunch, we walked to the bazaar, where he planned to shop for jewelry for his wife. For me, one of the grand wastes of time is watching someone bargain for anything at all, let alone alleged precious stones. So I excused myself. Mohsen seemed slightly displeased at this, expecting more hospitality from a friend. When we met up for dinner, Mohsen, with unnecessary enthusiasm, displays his prize catch of the day, a beautiful lapis lazuli necklace. He stayed on the topic some 45 seconds longer than necessary to convey a message that I believe should never have exceeded 10. I took this as gloating, as implying that I should have kept his company at the bazaar. Never accused of refusing an opportunity to humble a good friend, I reminded him that the only difference between a jeweler and a thief is a handshake. Mohsen conceded, putting the lapis away. During our chats, we often spoke about Mohsen's desire to go to the border region, where he felt he could put his language skills to better use. This would be a point of contention in our friendship. I tried appealing to reason, telling him that he could potentially get the attention of one of our seniors if he stayed in Kabul, thereby influencing the conflict at a strategic level. I appealed to emotion, reminding him of his obligation to his new bride and his family. None of my interventions worked. The border region was unsafe for all Americans, but it would be especially unsafe for Mohsen. Locals he encountered there would quickly identify him as a native. For each local who displayed pride that one of their own had become an American soldier, there would be no fewer than 3 who would brand him a traitor. I thought that our enemies would not rest until they killed him. They would be relentless. Regardless, after a few weeks of trying, Mohsen got his desired assignment and left the camp in mid-August of 2008. About a month later, I traveled home for my brother's wedding. On a random day, I looked at the faces of the fallen in the local paper. You don't ever look at that section expecting to see someone that you were just eating dinner with, not because the person was out of harm's path, but because you expect that you will get the bad news in a more direct way. But Mohsen had arrived at our camp by himself, and he left by himself. In the few weeks he was at my camp, he got to know only a handful of people. When I got back to Kabul, I looked up the incident reports. Mohsen had been assigned to a camp where they frequently went out on missions. Our enemies had struck American convoys from that camp at a rate of just a couple of attacks per month in the months prior to Mohsen's arrival. But in the 2 weeks prior to his death, the enemy had targeted Mohsen's convoy 4 times in 5 attacks. Relentless indeed. Our enemies had been hunting for Mohsen. Mike. In November of 2001, some of the heaviest fighting at the then just 6-week-old war occurred at Kali Jangi, literally Fort of War, an imposing structure guarding the ancient Shia city of Mazar-e Sharif from the west. It was here that General Rashid Dostum held some 400 Taliban fighters, rounded up during a death march from Kunduz to Mazar, across the Afghan northern plains. Dostum was one of several influential Afghans whom we enlisted for support after the 9/11 attacks. One of my friends, who had deployed there in October of 2001, shared a great account of General Tommy Franks speaking to Dostum on the phone about additional compensation for the assistance that the warlord was providing. "What's got to happen first is the mission," Franks thundered before slamming down the phone on Dostum. Franks, having risen through the ranks during the lean Clinton years, was probably uniquely prepared to handle Dostum. Dostum and his men picked up some 4,000 Taliban on the way to Mazar, but only 400 survived the journey. At Kali Jangi, the prisoners were stuffed into the basement of a small building with pink walls. If a sardine had viewed the cramped, filthy conditions in that basement, he would have quickly reconsidered his plight and happily lumbered back into his can. Mike and his partner arrived to question the Taliban prisoners. A few dozen of Dostum's men were all that stood between the 2 Americans and the prisoners. Initially, the prisoners, weary from the long trek, were likely just content to be off the container trucks. But perspectives and intentions would change quickly. Mike and his partner were focusing on the task at hand, not completely attuned to the changing attitude of the enemy, which was no doubt taking stock of scenes of friends being beaten and spirited off to unknown fates by Dostum's men. Recall that these were men who survived the death march, the march that had reportedly wiped out more than 3,000 of their comrades. Said another way, they were the strongest, toughest, and most resilient of the initial group. Even depleted in number, they still outnumbered Dostum's men by 3 or 4 to 1, and may have smuggled in weapons. Mike and his partner probably didn't know those crucial details. The prisoners began sizing up Mike, his partner, and Dostum's men. At a coordinated moment, when Mike's partner was away, they encircled Mike and began to pounce. The ensuing battle featured these prisoners, Dostum's men, some of whom were on horses, British Special Forces elements parachuting in, and precision-guided aerial munitions dropped from ground attack aircraft, all within the confines of a high-walled desert fortress. Frank. Some 8 years after Mike was killed, Frank arrived at Camp Span with a team of Navy personnel. They had trained together, done their pre-deployment workups together, and they had all traveled into theater together. In short, they were already a tight-knit group. Camp Span was entirely enclosed within Camp Shaheen, the main garrison for the Afghan 209th Corps. With some command buildings a short distance away at Kali Jangi, Shaheen was a perfect square, about 3/4 of a mile on each side, and Span occupied a small corner of the larger camp, with its own perimeter fence. We often place our camps within the walls of an Afghan camp to add a layer of protection. In concept, in 2007, I had deployed to Span for 6 weeks. An unexpected treat of this duty was getting to run the roughly 3-mile perimeter road of Shaheen. The weather in Mazar was pleasant. The air was clean, and the perimeter was perfectly flat, on the soft gravel. In short, excellent running conditions, if one so desires. 1 loop was a typical warm-up or cool-down run. 2 loops was a regular running day, and on a 3-loop day, with the greatest of intentions to complete the run, I would invariably begin evaluating the educational benefits of walking it in, from just past the last turn, which featured a boneyard of old Russian ground combat vehicles on a road conveniently parallel to the perimeter. Here, lazy runners could break into a trot as they tried to distinguish old Soviet T-55s from T-62s, while, more important, sparing their knees about a mile's worth of additional high-impact exercise. Running outside was not an easy option in Kabul, so being able to enjoy an outside jog while in Mazar was a welcome change. I did some form of running no fewer than 3 times a week, and I felt perfectly safe doing so. Nearly 2 years later, Frankie and his teammates shared this mindset. A few months into their deployment, during a Friday run, Frank and his running partner, in a foursome, had dropped about 50 yards behind the lead pair. As the lead pair rounded that final bend, an Afghan soldier came down off a watchtower and shot at the lead group, mortally wounding one of Frank's teammates. Knowing that their friends were wounded, Frank's partner made a break for the clinic, which was perhaps a quarter-mile away, while our beloved Frank stood with decision. You see, he was at that last turn on the perimeter road, alongside the boneyard of tanks and APCs that would have offered ample protection from the bullets that would soon fly his way. At 50 yards and a moving target, he probably would have reached cover in the boneyard. But the proposition Frank faced that day, as life unraveled before him, was, do I try to save my friends, or do I save myself? He did not know that one friend was already succumbing to wounds. It is a peculiar condition in humans, common even in the worst of pessimists, that when confronted with the prospect that one of our best friends has suffered a fatal accident, even one we have witnessed, we believe they are still alive. Some may explain this behavior as part of denial, but there is more to it. Our best friends are not mere mortals. They are role models. They are our superheroes. Mere car accidents, or bullets, or IEDs cannot end them. Their superpowers will carry them a little longer. In short, Frank charged the gunman that day, believing he would save his slightly wounded friends. As he approached the gunman, Frank yelled out, running toward him, but zigzagging as the gunman attempted to get Frank in his sights. 2 of Frank's teammates survived injuries and live today because of his bravery. Rosalind Roz Schulte was from St. Louis, Missouri. She was an officer in the Air Force and graduated from the Air Force Academy. She was residing in Hawaii at the time of her deployment. She was killed in action on May 20th, 2009. Sean Pine was from San Antonio, Texas. He was a retired Army officer. He died of wounds on May 20th, 2009. Mohsen Naqvi was from Newburgh, New York. He was an Army officer. He was killed in action on September 17th, 2008. Johnny Spann, aka Mike, was from Marion County, Alabama. He was a Marine Corps officer. He was residing in Northern Virginia at the time of his deployment. He was killed in action on November 25th, 2001. Francis Toner was from Rhode Island. He was a Navy officer and graduated from the Merchant Marine Academy. He was residing in Hawaii at the time of his deployment. He was killed in action on March 27th, 2009. I'd like to ask everyone listening if they could please just take a moment currently and have a moment of silence for all the veterans that have sacrificed themselves for our freedom. I shall say so long for now, until the next time we virtually meet.